All right, for more, let's speak to Jonathan Panikoff, Director, Scowcroft, Middle East Security Initiative, Atlantic Council. Thanks very much for joining us today. The Israelis, tough talk up to the last moments before the deal kicked in. Then the Hamas elite unit we saw in full uniform at the hostage transfer. It seems like the two sides are complying so far, but the tone has been pretty defiant. How is this helping to pave the way for the rest of phase one, would you say, and the future stages of the ceasefire?
Well, good morning, and thank you for having me. Look, obviously, this is a successful first day of the ceasefire, and you got to start somewhere, and this is a good place to start, seeing the 3 hostages released, and then Hamas being confident now with Israel having released the 90 Palestinian prisoners that it promised it would. Obviously, this is going to take some time. There's a reason that this is sequenced as it is, that it is not all the hostages at once or even all the hostages, the 33 that'll come out in phase one, nor is it all of the Palestinian prisoners. It's about confidence building measures and going back and forth, having enough aid delivery as promised by the Israelis, as well as ensuring that the hostages are not only in good shape, but the Israelis are given the list of names beforehand. And so it's a good start. It portends well for this first phase, but we're going to have to wait and see how it goes forward.
Hamas framing the Gaza ceasefire agreement as a victory for itself, a failure for Israel. With a power vacuum for Gazans, there are fears that Hamas could be more alive than Israel would like. How does this bode for a changed region and the two-state solution that's being pushed by major powers?
Well, unfortunately, I think we're pretty far from a two-state solution. We're further than we were on October 6th of 2023, that's for sure. In Israel, across the political spectrum, I think they're flummoxed, frankly, and gobsmacked, and not understanding how anybody in the world could think that this is the time for a two-state solution. And of course, across the Arab world and much of the West, folks think it's the only path forward. And so I think we're actually further than we were. The problem is, if Hamas really does have a meaningful amount of control left in Gaza, and it's not clear that they will, but if they do, well, then I think it's actually problematic because it's almost certainly going to portend that there isn't a two-state solution possible, that eventually you'll see more conflict, that the Israelis will go back in. The Trump administration, the incoming National Security Advisor, Mike Waltz, made very clear just today that if Hamas was still in power, it would support Israel going back in. And so that obviously will have a cascading effect for the second phase, the third phase. But again, I think it's a real question of what was propaganda today, of which there was quite a bit from Hamas, versus what their capabilities actually are. The Israelis really over the last 15 months have destroyed much of Hamas's leadership, much of their capabilities. Certainly the group wants to rebuild. Whether they can, though, I think is really a question. We'll have to wait a little bit to see what comes true from it.
And just as you said, Jonathan, Hamas has been weakened significantly and financially, politically as well, but they've pledged to rebuild. And we've seen in the past that when Israel pulls back the militant group, re-emerges. How likely is Hamas then on a recruitment drive at this point? And how likely are they preparing for the next conflict?
I think Hamas certainly is going to have a recruitment drive. We've seen some reporting, obviously, on this already. But again, you have real decimation of the top level. So Mohammed Sinwar, the brother of former leader Yahya Sinwar, is in charge nominally. He's the head of the military wing of Hamas in the Gaza Strip and is taking default head overall of Hamas. But it's not like it was with his brother. You have significant pressure from the external leadership, which actually cut this deal that is based right now in Doha and then was kicked out. They may end up in Istanbul. The reality is, I think we're going to have to wait and see. One thing to look at is that for years now, one of the reasons Hamas was able to build financially its weapons capabilities was fundamentally because Iran was supplying it to them. That's going to be harder today. It's one of the reasons the Israelis want to stay on the border between Gaza and Egypt. I think it's going to be harder to smuggle in the weapons like it previously was. That doesn't mean Hamas might not still be able to have some capabilities remaining and be able to recruit members, but I think it's going to be harder than it was. I don't think this is the same situation as it was after the conflict, say, in 2014.
And Jonathan, let's turn to the fractures in the Israeli cabinet. We know that the far right labels this deal catastrophic and the surrender deal as well. Can you tell us about the domestic challenges for Netanyahu, given there is still a long way to go in this ceasefire?
Yeah, absolutely. You put it correct. I mean, the fractions are quite extreme. You're going to see one of the ministers, the national security minister, who's an ultra-nationalist, Itamar Ben-Gvir. He's going to take his party out of the cabinet and out of government, which means the Israeli right, Prime Minister Netanyahu, and the government is going to have a 62 to 58 margin within the Knesset, the Israeli parliament. The question is, will the other ultranationalists eventually follow? Bezalel Smotrich, who is the finance minister. Right now, he said he's going to vote against the deal, which he did, but he's going to remain in the government. I think part of that is really selfish on his part and self-aggrandizing. He and Ben-Gvir do not get along well, and I think he wants to be the person that is looked to by ultranationalists and the settler movement as the person who got more annexation, for example, in the West Bank. The question is, if he were to eventually leave, you have more moderate parties that have said they will back the government so it doesn't fall to get through the second and third phases of the ceasefire. However, Prime Minister Netanyahu has always shown that his primary concern right now is remaining in power himself. Israeli elections don't have to come until 2026. And so if Smotrich left and the more moderate parties came in, I think they would get through the second and third phase of the ceasefire. But then Netanyahu would be at risk of seeing his government collapse. And so the tensions inherently within the Israeli political system are going to have an impact in the coming months as well.
Before we go, I want to zoom out a little bit. Pardon me, Jonathan. You recently wrote about how the war has reshaped the Middle East, particularly how Hezbollah is completely diminished, Lebanon entering a new chapter, also how the war led to the end of the Assad regime in Syria. What would the regional repercussions be if this ceasefire does not hold?
Well, if it doesn't hold, it's going to be really problematic because it sets, frankly, everybody back. Obviously, the humanitarian situation is already dire and will continue to get worse in Gaza. In Israel, they are already exhausted, but it also provides just regionally, it makes it harder for a number of Arab states that, frankly, would like a peaceful region and would like to see Israel better integrated. That includes both countries that have already normalized with Israel, like the United Arab Emirates, but also countries like Saudi Arabia that would like there to eventually be a two-state solution in order to be able to also normalize with Israel and move the region forward. If the ceasefire falls apart, the chances of all of those things happening just get delayed, if not eventually eliminated. And so there's real potential regional repercussions depending on how it falls apart, who's to blame for it, if it's because Hamas attacks or doesn't uphold its end of the bargain versus if it's because Israel doesn't. All of these factors come into play. And you even have, for instance, at a time when Iran is at its weakest, the US, Israel, the European three, the UK, Germany, and France really want to refocus on Iran. That becomes harder to do as well.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. Jonathan Panikoff is the director of Scowcroft Middle East Security Initiative at the Atlantic Council. Appreciate your time.